All right, everybody. So today we are going to be reading chapter 12, which is called Behind the Door. So I am going to ask that you guys have your books out and that you're following along. You can listen to my voice, but I also want you to be looking at the book as well. So if we were to review last chapter, we know that Alex made it into the Dosmary mine, and we can infer that Ian Ryder was down there based on the clues that were left. There was the scuba suit and the rope that was down there. So even though Alex had his own supplies, he was able to use what his uncle had left behind. And we know now that he was using the map, going through the different tunnels and stuff, and then he found the tunnel that would lead him down to hopefully what he is assuming would be on the other side of the door that he got caught by Nadia Vol down at the bottom of the steps. So chapter 12 starts on page 134, and it is called Behind the Door. So I want you to stop and take a second and think about what you think might happen in this chapter. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Alex swam forward slowly, completely blind, afraid that at any moment he would crack his head against rock. Despite the dry suit, he had long ago felt the chill of the water and knew that he had to find his way onto dry land soon. His hand brushed against something, but his fingers were too numb to tell what it was. He reached out and pulled himself forward. His feet touched the bottom, and it was then that he realized he could see. Somehow, from somewhere, light was seeping into the area beyond the submerged tunnel. And if you think about that, sometimes like maybe when you wake up in the morning or if you're going to bed and it's really dark in your room, you can kind of see like a shadow of your hand. And that's kind of what Alex is experiencing right now. Slowly, his vision adjusted itself. Waving his hand in front of his face, he could just make out his fingers. He was holding onto a wooden beam, a collapsed roof support. He closed his eyes and then opened them again. The darkness had retreated, showing him a crossroads cut into the rock, the meeting place of three tunnels. The fourth, behind him, was the one that was flooded. As vague as the light was, it gave him strength. Using the beam as a makeshift jetty, he clambered onto the rock. At the same time, he became aware of a soft, throbbing sound. He couldn't be sure if it was near or far, but he remembered what he had heard under Block D, in front of the metal door, and he knew that he had arrived. So now he knows that he's down near the room where he got caught by Nadia Vol down at the bottom of the steps. He stripped off the dry suit. It had served him well. The main part of his body was dry, even though ice-cold water dripped out of his hair and down his neck. His shoes and socks were sodden, and that just means soaked. When he moved forward, his feet squelched, and he had to take off his shoes and shake them out before he could go on. Ian Ryder's map was still folded in his pocket, but he no longer had any need of it. All he had to do was follow the light. He went straight forward to another intersection, then turned right. The light was so bright now that he could actually make out the door of the rock, dark brown and gray. The throbbing was also getting louder, and Alex could feel a rush of cool air streaming toward him. He moved forward, cautiously, wondering what he was about to come to. He turned a corner, and suddenly the rock on both sides gave way to new brick with metal grills set at intervals just above the level of the floor. The old mine shaft had been converted. It was being used as an outlet for some sort of air conditioning system. The light that had guided Alex was coming out of the grills. So if you think about, when you're at home, some people have for their heating and cooling system, there's like a little metal grate that sometimes they're on the ceiling, sometimes they're on the bottom part of a wall, sometimes they're even on the floor, and it has little slits of metal in it. And that's kind of what is helping Alex. That's how he's able to navigate. He can see the light coming through that. He knelt beside the first of these and looked through into a large white tiled room, a laboratory with complicated glass and steel equipment laid out over work surfaces. The room was empty. Tentatively, Alex took hold of the grill, but it was firmly secured, bolted into the rock face. The second grill belonged to the same room. It was also screwed in tight. Alex continued up the tunnel to a third grill. This one looked into a storage room filled with the silver box that Alex had seen being delivered by the submarine the night before. He took the grill in both hands and pulled it. It came away from the wall easily, and looking closer, he understood why. Once again, Ian Ryder had been here ahead of him. He had cut through the bolts, hiding it in place. Alex set the grill down silently, glad that he had found the strength to go forward. Carefully, he squeezed through the rectangular hole in the wall and into the room. At the last minute, lying on his stomach with his feet dangling below, He reached for the grill and set it back in place. Provided nobody looked too closely, they wouldn't see anything wrong. The ground was a long way away, at least twice his own height, but that wasn't going to stop him now. He dropped down and landed cat-like on the balls of his feet. The throbbing was louder, coming from somewhere outside. It would cover any noise he made. He went over to the nearest of the silver boxes and examined it. He found 2 catches on the lid and pressed. The box clicked open in his hands, but when he looked inside, it was empty. Whatever had been delivered was already in use. He checked for cameras, found none, then crossed to the door. It was unlocked. He opened it 1 inch at a time and peered out. The door led onto a wide corridor with an automatic sliding door at each end and a silver rail running its full length. 1900 hours, red shift to assembly line, blue shift to decontamination. The voice rang out over a loudspeaker system, neither male nor female, emotionless, inhuman. Alex glanced at his watch. It was already 7 o'clock in the evening. It had taken him longer than he had thought to get through the mine. He stole forward. It wasn't exactly a passage that he had found. It was more an observation platform. He reached the rail and looked down. Alex hadn't had any idea what he would find behind the metal door, but what he was seeing now was far beyond anything he could have imagined. It was a huge chamber, the walls, half-naked rock, half-polished steel, lined with computer equipment, electronic meters, machines that blinked and flickered with life of their own. It was staffed by 40 or 50 people, some in white coats, others in overalls, all wearing armbands of different colors, red, yellow, blue, and green. Arc lights beamed down from above. Armed guards stood at each doorway, watching the work with blank faces. For this was where the Stormbreakers were being assembled. The computers were being slowly carried into a long, continuous line along a conveyor belt past the various scientists and technicians. The strange thing was that they already looked finished, and of course they had to be. Sale had told him. They were actually being shipped out during the course of the afternoon and night. So what last-minute adjustment was being made here in this secret factory? And why was so much of the production line hidden away? What Alex had seen as he crept around Sale Enterprises had only been the tip of the iceberg. The main body of the factory was here underground. And if we think about that, if Sale Enterprises is up to something, that's the perfect spot for them to be, is underground, where if there's something fishy going on, nobody's going to try to look down there. He looked more closely. He remembered the Stormbreaker that he had used, and now he noticed something that he hadn't seen then. A strip of plastic had been drawn back in the casing above each of the screens to reveal a small compartment, cylindrical and about 5 inches deep. The computers were passing underneath a bizarre machine, cantilevers, wires, and hydraulic arms. Opaque silver test tubes were being fed along a narrow cage, moving forward as if to greet the computers, 1 tube for each computer. There was a meeting point. With infinite precision, the tubes were lifted out, brought around, and then dropped into the exposed compartments. After that, the Stormbreakers were accelerated forward. A second machine closed and heat sealed the plastic strip. By the time the computers had reached the end of the line, where they were packed into red and white Sale Enterprises boxes, the compartments were completely invisible. So if you think about that, like on your Chromebooks or whatever computer you're using, up at the top where your camera would be, there was a little slit, okay, a little rectangle. That part there was a seal on it that was taken off, and something was put into that. The cover went back on and it was heat sealed. Okay, so there's something in these computers. A movement caught his eye, and Alex looked beyond the assembly line and through a huge window with the chamber next door. 2 men in spacesuits were walking clumsily together as if in slow motion. They stopped. An alarm began to sound, and suddenly they disappeared in a cloud of white steam. Alex remembered what he had just heard. Were they being decontaminated? But if the Stormbreakers were based on the round processor, then there couldn't possibly be any need for such extremes. And anyway, this was like nothing Alex had ever seen before. If the men were being decontaminated, what were they being decontaminated from? Agent Grigorovich, report to the biocontainment zone. This is a call for Agent Grigorovich. A lean, fair-haired figure dressed in black detached himself from the assembly line and walked languidly toward a door that slid open to receive him. For the second time, Alex found himself looking at the Russian contract killer, Yasen Grigorovich. What was going on? Alex thought back to the submarine and the vacuum-sealed boxes. Of course, Yasin had brought the test tubes that were even now being inserted into the computers. The test tubes were some sort of weapon that he was using to sabotage them. No, that wasn't possible. Back in Port Town, the librarian had told him that Ian Ryder had been asking for books about computer viruses. Viruses, decontamination, the biocontainment zone. Understanding came, and with it something cold and solid jabbing into the back of his neck. Alex hadn't even heard the door open behind him, but he slowly straightened up as a voice spoke softly into his ear. So Alex has come to this conclusion that it's not a computer virus that's being put into the computers. It is some kind of human virus, okay? And he figured this out, and just as he figured this out, there's something cold right at the back of his neck. Stand up, keep your hands by your sides. If you make any sudden move, I'll shoot you in the head. And I think that this is a really bad thing that happened to Alex. I don't think that this is something that's going to prove that he would be a good spy, because Alex was caught behind the door, okay? Or if we think about it this way, Alex was caught in the laboratory. And I would say that usually good spies are aware of their surroundings. I mean, he's in a spot where he knows that he shouldn't be, and I think that if he was aware of his surroundings, he would have been able to maybe move a little bit quicker and get out of that situation. So I think it's a really bad thing that Alex got caught in the laboratory, because usually good spies are aware of their surroundings. He looked slowly around. A single guard stood behind him and a gun in his hand. It was the sort of thing that Alex had seen 1,000 times in films and on television, and he was shocked by how different the reality was. The gun was a Browning automatic pistol, and one twitch of the man's finger would send a 9mm bullet shattering through his skull and into his brain. The very thought of it made him feel sick. So Alex has gotten himself into some trouble. There's a man behind him with a gun. He stood up. The guard was in his 20s, pale-faced and puzzled. Alex had never seen him before, but more importantly, he had never seen Alex. He hadn't expected to come across a boy. That might help. Who are you? He asked. What are you doing here? I'm staying with Mr. Sale, Alex said. He stared at the gun. Why are you pointing that at me? I'm not doing anything wrong. He sounded pathetic. Little boy lost. But it had the desired effect. The guard hesitated, slightly lowering the gun. At that moment, Alex struck. It was another classic karate blow, this time twisting his body around and driving his elbow into the side of the man's head just below his ear. The guard didn't even cry out. His eyes rolled and he went limp. Alex had almost certainly knocked him out with the single punch, but he couldn't take chances and followed it through with a knee into the groin. The guard folded, his pistol falling to the ground. Quickly, Alex dragged him back away from the railings. He looked down. Nobody had seen what had happened. And I would say that's a really good thing that Alex did there. Alex took out the guard in the laboratory. And I would say typically a good spy is able to defend themselves, okay? So Alex took out the guard in the laboratory, and typically a good spy is able to defend themselves, right? I mean, this is not the first time that Alex has done this. But the guard wouldn't be unconscious for long, and Alex knew he had to get out of here, not just back up to ground level, but out of Sale Enterprises altogether. He had to contact Mrs. Jones. He still didn't know how or why, but he knew now that the Stormbreakers had been turning into killing machines. There was less than 24 hours until the launch at the Science Museum. Somehow Alex had to stop it from happening. He ran. The door at the end of the passage slid open, and he found himself in a curving white corridor with windowless offices built into what must be yet more shafts of the Dasmari mine. He knew he couldn't go back the way he had come. He was too tired, and even if he could find his way through the mine, he'd never be able to manage the swim a second time. His only chance was the door that had first led him here. It led to the metal staircase that would bring him to Block D. There was a telephone in his room. Failing that, he could use the Game Boy to transmit a message, but MI6 had to know what he had found out. He reached the end of the corridor, then ducked back as 3 guards appeared, walking together toward a set of double doors. Fortunately, they hadn't seen him. Nobody knew he was here. He was going to be all right. And then the alarms went off. A siren wailing electronically above the corridors, leaping out from the corners, echoing everywhere. Overhead, a light began to flash red. The guards wheeled around and saw Alex. Unlike the man on the observation platform, they didn't hesitate. As Alex leaped headfirst through the nearest door, they brought up their machine guns and fired. Bullets slammed into the wall beside him and ricocheted across the passageway. Alex landed flat on his stomach and kicked out, slamming the door behind him. He straightened up, found a bolt, and rammed it home. A second later, there was an explosive hammering on the other side as the guards fired at the door, but it was solid metal. It would hold. Alex was standing in a metal passageway leading to a tangle of pipes and cylinders, like the boiler room of a ship. The alarm was as loud here as it had been in the main chamber. It seemed to be coming from everywhere. He leaped down the staircase 3 steps at a time and skidded to a halt, searching for a way out. He had a choice of the 3 corridors, but then he heard the rattle of feet and he knew that his choice had just become 2. He wished now that he had thought to pick up the Browning automatic. He was alone and unarmed, the only duck in a shooting gallery with guns everywhere and no way out. Was this what MI6 had trained him for? If so, 2 weeks hadn't been enough. So I'd say that that's probably a bad thing that Alex did. When he took out the guard the first time, Alex did not pick up the guard's gun. And usually a good spy would be resourceful, right? He would have picked that up and he would have been able to defend himself that way if he needed to. He ran on, weaving in and out of the pipes, trying every door he came to. A room with more spacesuits hanging on hooks, a shower room, another large laboratory with a second door leading out, and in the middle, a glass tank shaped like a barrel filled with green liquid. Tangles of rubber tubing sprouted out of the tank, trays filled with test tubes all around. And we know that when Alex was on the other side of the door, when he used the Game Boy, he saw something that kind of looked like a barrel, okay? So we have this barrel, and if you can imagine, there are some tubes that are coming out the sides of it with a green liquid inside. The barrel-shaped tank, the trays. Alex had seen them before as vague outlines on his Game Boy. He must have been standing on the other side of the second door. He ran over to it. It was locked from the inside, electronically, with a glass plate against the wall. He would never be able to open it. He was trapped. Footsteps approached. Alex just had time to hide himself on the floor, underneath one of the work surfaces, before the first door was thrown open and 2 more guards ran into the laboratory. They took a quick look around, without seeing him. "Not here," one of them said. "You'd better go up." One guard walked out of the way he had come. The other went over to the door and placed his hand on the glass identification panel. There was a green glow and the door buzzed loudly. The guard threw it open and disappeared. Alex rolled forward as the door swung shut and just managed to get his hand into the crack. He waited a moment, then stood up. He opened the door. As he had hoped, he was looking out into the unfinished passageway where he had been surprised by Nadia Vole. So he has made it through the laboratory now. The guard had already gone on ahead. Alex slipped out, closing the door behind him, cutting off the sound of the siren. He made his way up the metal stairs. They led him back to the glass corridor that joined Block C and D. Alex was grateful to be back above ground. He found a door and slipped outside. The sun had already set, but across the lawn the airstrip was ablaze, artificially illuminated by the sort of lights Alex had seen in soccer stadiums. There were about a dozen trucks parked next to each other. Men were loading them up with heavy, square red and white boxes. The cargo plane that Alex had seen when he arrived rumbled down the runway and launched into the air. Alex knew that he was looking at the end of the assembly line. The red and white boxes were the same ones he had seen in the underground chamber. The Stormbreakers, complete with their deadly secret, were being loaded up and delivered. By morning, they would be all over the country. Keeping low, he ran past the fountain and across the grass. He thought about making for the main gate, but he knew that was hopeless. The guards would have been alerted. They'd be waiting for him. Nor could he climb the perimeter fence, not with the razor wire stretched out across the top. No, his own room seemed the best answer. The telephone was there, and so were his only weapons, the few gadgets that Smithers had given him 4 days, or was it 4 years ago? He entered the house through the kitchen, the same way he had left it the night before. It was only 8 o'clock, but the whole place seemed to be deserted. He ran up the staircase and along the corridor to his room on the first floor. Slowly he opened the door. It seemed his luck was holding out. There was nobody there. Without turning on the light, he went inside and snatched up the telephone. The lines were dead. Never mind. He found the cartridges for his Game Boy, his yo-yo, the Zit Cream, and crammed them into his pockets. He had already decided not to stay here. It was too dangerous. He would find somewhere to hide out. Then he would use the Nemesis cartridge to contact MI6. He went back to the door and opened it. With a shock, he saw Mr. Grin standing in the hallway, looking hideous with his face, his ginger hair, and his mauve, twisted smile. Alex reacted quickly, striking out with the heel of his right hand, but Mr. Grin was quicker. He ducked to one side, then his hand shot out the side of it, driving into Alex's throat. Alex gasped for breath, but none came. The butler made an inarticulate sound and lashed out a second time. Alex got the impression that behind the livid scars, he really was grinning, enjoying himself. He tried to avoid the blow, but Mr. Grin's first hit him square on the jaw. He was spun into the bedroom, falling backwards. He never even remembered hitting the floor. All right, so those of you that have one of the blue books, the ones that we were not using in class, just be sure that when you're filling out your evidence logs that you use the page number according to whatever edition of the book that you have. All right, guys, so we're getting closer to the end of the novel. Next time we read, it will be chapter 13, or we're going to be on 14 already. Holy cow, there's only 17 chapters, okay? So next time we're going to be on chapter 13. All right, bye, guys.